Kia ora koutou and welcome to this Resilience Challenge webinar. Ko Caitlin Carew tōku ingoa, no te awa kairangi ahau. I'm the Senior Communications Advisor for the Resilience National Science Challenge, and today we have a slightly unusual webinar format. As many of you know, we held our final Resilience Challenge symposium, Te Tai Whanake, in May, and we had some really great discussions about natural hazards, new knowledge and tools, and what that all means for our resilience building efforts. We had two sessions in particular, one on adaptation for natural hazard resilience and one on decision making for hazard risk management, that generated a lot of questions from the audience, and we weren't able to address all of those in the allocated time. So some of the panelists from those sessions have kindly come back to continue these conversations, and we're very grateful to them. Thank you. Shortly, I'll explain the webinar format and introduce the panel, but first I'll settle us in with our karakia whiti ora. Ke mihi te pō rangahaua te ao, kia iorangi, kia io whenua, kei ngā mata o te ariki, kei matanuku, kei matarangi, kei reira koe e tāne te waiora, ko ngā maungaru, ko ngā awa parawhenua, here ute ki tai, kia tangaroa e. Ko koe, ko au, ko tau nei, whiti ao, whiti ora, are mai te toki, haumi e, hui e, tāiaki e. So unlike most webinars, we aren't going to have presentations from our panel. We'll have a quick preamble from Dr. Nick Craddock-Henry, Principal Social Scientist at GNS Science, to set the context for these discussions. And then I'll get the ball rolling with a few of the most upvoted questions from our symposium Slido. And then we'll move to questions from you, our audience. So this is what we're here for today, to address questions you might have on aspects of adaptation and planning for natural hazards, how we best engage with our communities, different cultural approaches to adaptation, what it means for our infrastructure, things like access to data and evidence, and what are the barriers for making decisions based on the best evidence. So please use the Q&A function to ask your questions at any time. We have 7 panelists, all with different backgrounds and areas of expertise, so if possible, please indicate who your question is for. This event is being recorded and we'll make the recording available later this week, so you can pass this on to colleagues who you think might be interested. I'll hand over now to our panelists to introduce themselves. We'll start with Dr. Sarah Bevan from the University of Canterbury. Over to you, Sarah.
Kia ora koutou, ko Sarah Bevan, tōku ingoa. I'm the co-director of the Disaster Risk and Resilience program at the University of Canterbury. We're based in the School of Earth and Environment. And I'm part of this partly because I was involved with Ian White and Raven Cretney and Christina Hanna in an RPM program under RNC, looking at risky decisions and the way that decisions are made and what those decisions are based on. So that's probably enough from me. I'll hand over to the next panelist. Cheers.
Thank you, Sarah. Akuhata, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Morena koutou, ko Akoutou Bailey Wini atu tōku ingoa, he uri ahau no tūharangi me ngā te whakaue, me ngā te tūtete whā no Rotorua ahau. Kia ora, I'm Akoutou, PhD student at the University of Waikato. Final year PhD student actually, which is quite exciting to sort of be on that final stretch. I can see the end of the tunnel, but yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done before I get there. I'm also a consultant at Paddle Delamore Partners, where I do a lot of climate adaptation mahi with Māori communities around the country. And I guess today I'm just going to share a bit of the experiences I've had in working with Māori communities in the climate adaptation space, as well as with other colleagues as well. So I guess I'll pass the raka on to Tom Fitzgerald.
Morena koutou, ko Tom Fitzgerald tōku ingoa. I've got 2 roles related to this kind of topic. First is my day job. I work for a union of councils and mana whenua and central government in a regional growth partnership for Wellington. It's called the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee. And in my spare time, I co-convene and founded the Aotearoa Climate Adaptation Network, which is transitioning to the Aotearoa Society of Adaptation Professionals this year, or ASAP. So that's my bag, and I'll pass over to Wendy.
Morena, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Wendy Saunders aho. I am a Principal Advisor and Champion of Land Use Planning at the Natural Hazards Commission. So from the 1st of July, the EQC has changed their name and we come under new legislation now. So what was the EQC is now the Natural Hazards Commission, if you weren't aware of that. And we care about these topics that we'll be discussing today because we carry a lot of the liability through our insurance cover for poor decision making. I've got a background in land use planning for natural hazards, about 20 or so more years of that now. Particularly risk-based planning, and last time at the seminar I was talking about preemptive land use planning for recovery. So thank you. I'll pass on to Lara.
Ata Marie. Kia ora, I'm Lara. I have my own consultancy called Awakening Aotearoa. And yeah, it's focused, I guess, on treaty-centric governance, research, planning, and adaptation. And yeah, I've done quite a lot of research in this space, particularly with Māori communities, iwi hapu, and looking also across Aotearoa and how we can sort of scale things up to empower and enable us throughout all the spaces that we need to. But particularly through legislation and policy and practice. Yeah. Kia ora. Judy?
Yeah, kia ora tātou. I'm Judy Lawrence from Victoria University, and also I'm attached to the Antarctic Research Centre. My main research in the Resilience Science Challenge was around enabling coastal adaptation, and this covered the work around sea level rise, and other adaptation, but particularly around the use of dynamic adaptive pathways planning and decision making under uncertainty. And this also covered the planning side of what do we do when our institutional and governance arrangements are inadequate for the planning challenge that we have from climate change. So my interest is in preemptive planning, anticipatory planning, and enabling our unblocking of barriers to the climate change response to natural hazards and wider. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. I think, Nick, you're the last one to introduce yourself, and if you could then perhaps just move on to your scene setting discussion. Thank you.
Sure thing. Kia ora koutou. I'm Nick Craddock-Henry. I'm Principal Scientist with GNS Science in the Department of Society and Infrastructure. And for the last 5 years, I've been co-leading the Resilience in Practice model alongside Julia Becker, which was sort of the quote-unquote social science and governance program within the Resilience Science Challenge. And prior to that, I was involved in the rural program. So I've had a long history over the last 10 years with both resilience and the Deep South National Science Challenges. So hopefully you can all see my screen. Caitlin's asked me to just provide a bit of scene setting and context for the panel discussion. And it probably goes without saying we're all probably very familiar with the extent to which climate emergencies have happened with increasing frequency over the last year or so. New Zealand's gone from about 1 to 2 climate-related weather events between sort of 2002, 2018. I think there was about $123 million a year average in terms of the losses. Between 2019 and 2022, insured losses from weather-related events increased to about 600 million, not accounting for inflation. And then, of course, with Cyclone Gabrielle last year, and the Auckland floods, that rose substantially. As a colleague at Lund University is fond of saying, climate change is here, it's now, it's us, but we can do something about it. And so there is, while the sort of context is that there is a significant challenge from climate change, there's also a significant opportunity, which is what we're sort of here to discuss today. But climate change, of course, isn't the only thing that we have to manage. As Wendy will sort of elaborate on with the now Natural Hazards Commission, climate change is just one shock or one stress that we have to contend with, whether it's coastal hazards and erosion, flood, economic shocks, fire, and of course, earthquake and tsunami. So climate change sort of exacerbates and compounds these existing shocks and stresses. So it's not simply about adapting to climate change, but it's also building our resilience more generally to enable flexible, adaptive responses to a number of shocks and stresses. So then there is this sort of need for both adaptation and resilience, not only to sort of reduce losses, so of course reduce those economic losses, but a need to reduce our exposure to climate, to enhance well-being, and to secure livelihoods in the face of change. And so when we talk about adaptation, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change defines adaptation as the process of adjusting to actual or expected climate and its effects in order to moderate harm, but also to exploit beneficial opportunities. So we need to reduce risk, but climate change will also create potential opportunities, and how do we realize those? But alongside that, we also want to think about the concept or the capacity for resilience. So when we think about sort of the links between human, natural, social, and economic systems, how can we respond? How can we cope? How can we enhance our ability to withstand those events and to potentially transform in the face of them? And so there is in the academic literature some discussion about whether those are two separate things, whether they're actually kind of related concepts, and to what extent they are indeed complementary. And in New Zealand, of course, we have a resilience strategy. We also have a national adaptation plan. And we have communities that focus primarily on geohazards and reducing losses from earthquakes and tsunami, as well as those that are focused on climate change adaptation. So one of the challenges, of course, is to bridge some of those gaps between those, both in terms of policy, practice, and research. And so reflecting on some of the sort of discussions that have happened, as well as some of the research that's gone on in the resilience challenge over the last few years, particularly in RPM, but as well as reflecting on the conversation at the Hui the other day, I think there was kind of four main things that kind of really came out of that, and which can provide sort of a basis for further conversation today. The first is the need to recognize that there is no single monolithic future. So work by Raven Cretney, Ian White, Christina Hanna, and indeed some of a lot of what other people's work also kind of reflects on is the fact that, the future is not determined. While we know that the climate is changing, the way in which that unfolds, both in terms of the climate, but also in terms of our response, is very much socially and politically determined. So in a recent paper by Raven Cretney and colleagues, they used submissions on the National Adaptation Plan to identify 4 different potential futures that were kind of informed by these social and political sort of views. So one would be a data-driven resilience, in which we rely on increasing precision and data to model these prospective futures. The second is to see the future as one of growth and opportunity, in which we kind of realize positive and exploit those positive opportunities. A third future that they identified was one in which sort of we transform the relationship between nature and society. So think green infrastructure, green and blue infrastructure. And then their fourth one was a flax roots perspective, in which Te Maori and Indigenous worldviews inform a transformational relationship with the future and with society. So I think, first of all, it's important to recognize in these conversations that there are multiple futures and that these futures are largely sort of socially and politically determined. Second, I think, as Judy and others will talk to, is there is this need to respond to cascading and compounding events. So we're not just responding to climate change, but we need to understand the way in which climate change acts as a risk multiplier, and that these things cascade and compound in unexpected ways across linked systems. So if we take energy systems or transportation systems, there's both a hazard component, but there's also a need to understand not only the sort of long-standing social, economic, cultural vulnerabilities, the extent to which those systems are exposed, and how our response in turn shapes those conditions. The third sort of thing that's really seems to be coming out in a lot of these conversations is the need to avoid maladaptation and the need to consider how some of our adaptation strategies may in fact lock in undesirable pathways, may increase risks for other communities or for other places, or to which they are essentially kicking the can of costs down the road for another generation to deal with. So when we are talking about adaptation decisions and adaptation planning, I think there's important to recognize and understand this need not only to improve foresight, but to understand this issue of maladaptation. And finally, and probably most importantly, is I think there is in a lot of these conversations that we've been having and that came up in the symposium was understanding effective adaptation, and adaptation for whom, adaptation of what to what, but whose adaptation are we talking about? And how is adaptation situated within different communities, and how those perspectives on adaptation are very much shaped by opportunities, by society, by culture, by the opportunities, by long-standing social and political conditions. And so that adaptation is not simply a technical process, but it's also very much a social one. So when we talk about and get into the sort of the Q&A, I think a few things to sort of just bear in mind. One is this need to plan for multiple futures. Second is the need for this linked up and systems perspective, that we don't simply think of adaptation in terms of isolated or singular decision making, or that we think only in terms of natural hazards or climate change, but that we actually need to consider them as a whole linked up system. Third, I think there is a need to acknowledge this uncertainty, as Judy talked about, this uncertainty, this very fast moving picture, the different goals, which may be quite ambiguous depending on whose future is being privileged and whose is being marginalized, the extent to which power and politics inform and shape adaptation and decision-making processes, and as Sarah will talk to, the risks associated with decision making. Finally, there's that need to incorporate flexibility in our planning, and are our planning processes as they are currently designed actually fit for purpose in a world in which there's much more dynamism, in which there's less stationarity, and in which there's a very fast moving temporal spatial picture. Best practice and incremental adaptation is of course necessary, but there's also probably a need to think about the sorts of transformational changes that are potentially required. And finally, how do we move from talking about adaptation and talking about making better decisions to actually accelerating action on the ground?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick. That was really useful. I would encourage everyone to start popping their questions for our panel in the Q&A function. I can see one there, but we need some more. So just while we wait for those questions to start rolling in, I'll kick us off with a few of the most popular questions that were asked at our Te Tai Whanake symposium, but that we didn't get to. So our first question is what factors commonly derail effective decision making in natural hazard risk management and policy interventions? So I'm going to throw that one to Tom first of all for a practitioner view.
Kia ora, thanks, Caitlin. Well, Nick, you've done a great job covering a lot of that work in there, and I think the diagram that you put up that resonates with me often is the helicopter diagram that also includes response in that. So there's some risks actually with some of the responses that can be put in place. But in terms of the factors derailing, it's largely all the same ones: data, short-termism, changing political priorities, lack of a mandate around adaptation, resource constraints, capacity. I mean, defining what is effective as well. But I wanted to just quickly focus on risk governance, and risk governance in the context I'm referring to, I suppose, refers to the processes, structures and mechanisms to identify, assess, communicate and ultimately manage natural hazard risk, but it requires an integrated and collaborative approach. And I think in many instances, our current approach is what I would call disintegrated. So let me operationalise that for you. Adaptation is place-based largely, it's local. So at the coast, in the face of rising seas, there's multiple layers of legislation, policies, time horizons, multiple institutions, interested parties, perspectives, divergent worldviews and values, different ecosystems, and linear infrastructure that's servicing far-flung communities. So effective decision-making requires effective collaboration and to do that, effective participatory processes as well. So big sort of ugly systemic risks like climate change require us to do things differently, some sort of innovation, let's try something new. And I wanted to put the deliberative democratic approaches on the table as something that could look at providing some of these answers to these questions. Those processes have been trialled in different areas, but they have been largely successful in legitimising this sort of work, building trust, providing a space for resolving conflict, but also building those connections between people, and ultimately that sort of uplift in community capacity, but and ideally eventually leading to better decision making.
Awesome, thank you for that, Tom. Wendy, would you like to have a go at this one?
Sure thing. I started making a list of some of these factors, and it turned into a long list. So, I'll just pick out a few of those. Some of them are what Tom said, you know, the competing priorities and pressures that not only the national government are under, but councils as well. And for instance, granny flats. Who would have thought that we would need a national policy statement or any use on granny flats when we can't even situate where we're putting our homes correctly, let alone allowing granny flats to go in with little or no ability for councils to say, no, it's in a bad place. So I think we need to be pragmatic and we need to be able to say no, and decision makers need the confidence to be able to say no. But often they don't understand risk or risk management. So I think there's still a lot of upskilling that's required for our decision makers to understand hazard, to understand what is climate adaptation, what is risk management, and how do they all come together. I think often, you know, data comes up a lot, that we don't have enough information or, you know, good enough information, but we actually often do have enough information to make a decision on. We need to take into account the uncertainties of the information and of the decision, but I think sometimes not having enough information can be a bit of an excuse to push that decision further into the future. And I think at the moment, one of the big factors is that we're not actually planning. And this is really annoying me at the moment and frustrating me, is that we talk about planning, but are we actually doing planning? I think we're reacting to policies that are coming out. We need to be planning for those legacy issues that we already have from when we didn't have good enough information. We need to be planning for those issues that we're dealing with today as well as those in the future. And I think we shouldn't be relying on the insurers coverage to be the trigger for we need to start planning, or this isn't good enough, there's outrage because the people can no longer get insurance cover. I think it's a failure of planning when the insurers actually retreat, because we should have planned for that eventuality. So yes, that was just a few of my ones on my list for today. Thanks, Caitlin.
Awesome. Thank you, Wendy. Sarah, would you like to have a go at this one?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, Tom and Wendy. Really, really useful contributions to this. I thought that the most useful thing I might be able to do is just to give a wee bit of an overview of some of the findings in terms of why things are so difficult. And so I think particularly what Tom was talking about in terms of the need to have a more joined up collaborative approach. There's actually a lot of evidence out there now for why that isn't actually happening, or why it is so difficult to do that. And I think mainly it just shows that the policy sector and the science sector and other sectors as well, but I'm just going to restrict my comments to the policy and science sectors, that they have very different drivers. They're concerned about very different things, and this makes it very hard to bring them together to make decisions together, or for science to inform decision making. And so, for example, research into the policy sector has found that there's quite an overwhelming agreement amongst policy workers that their primary responsibilities are to ministers, and that they must enter social context, and that it's really important they don't rely too much on evidence. Now, that's something that they all agree on. This is not part of their job. So if you have a situation where that's the case, and then some of the other work looking in that space is that, one of the things that this creates in a way is that they tend to judge quality on a case-by-case basis. And they use criteria that are not discussed. And so, and they don't really even often understand them, because they're trying to guess what their political leadership wants them to do. So that in a sense, you've got a very kind of tight policy sector, which is very heavily dominated by ministers on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you have a science community where people are rewarded for kind of very unrestrained self-promotion. They fight for winner-takes-all sort of prizes like positions and research funding and various other things. And they're expected and trained to sort of criticize as a matter of course and disagree with each other and sort of get into disputes with each other. And so what that actually means is that you end up with a culture where, it can be quite combative actually. And so what you have is two cultures which are very different. You've got one in the policy sector where people are really required to absolutely prioritise the needs of their line management over everything else, to work together, to be very kind of like kind of working upwards in a way towards doing what people want. And on the other hand, you've got the science domain where you've got vigorous debate, championing credible science, worrying much more about the detail of science than about the end point of a decision-making point. So basically what you get that creates this enormous misalignment. So the second point I wanted to make is just that there's also quite a lot of quite heartening evidence, and again, referring especially to Tom, whose Wellington Regional Leadership Community, I think, is a good example of this, where if in fact you put a structure in place that brings people together from these communities so that they can learn each other and learn from each other and get to know each other critically, build consensus, then a lot of those misalignments start to have a less of an impact as people, and so they can actually be quite effective, those structures, and there's quite a lot of evidence of success, particularly in Europe, from working in that way. So I think that's the difficulty with it is, however, that all the evidence is that what's required is stable, ongoing, adequate funding, a stable situation so they know they can keep working in an ongoing way. It doesn't work if you bring them together for 5 minutes and then it breaks down again. There needs to be very strong kind of cross-sector relationships, and the structure and the reason for it being brought together needs to be transparent. So the criteria, what they're meant to be doing, everyone should understand that together. That all needs to be in the public domain. And so the difficulty with that, and this is my third point, and it comes to something that I'm sure Judy will talk to, which is about uncertainty, and I think that's also been mentioned by all the speakers so far, is that building this kind of consensus is extremely difficult in an environment where decisions are being made very fast and policy is changing very rapidly and events are moving very rapidly. And I think I did some work in this area in terms of the ongoing collaborations that were affected by the earthquakes in Christchurch. And so I think that recovery environments in particular are a really good example of this. It's very difficult to build consensus and plan for the future when everything is changing, week by week in a recovery environment, especially a recovery decision-making environment. So we're talking about governance environments and the way that Tom defined governance. And I think the last one is what's happening now globally, and partly under the influence, I think, of climate change and other earth systems that are starting to fail, and the social systems are becoming much more volatile in this current environment, that we are entering into a particularly volatile policymaking environment, I think, right now. And so really, I think my main message is that there are ways to address these, but it has to be recognised we're dealing with massive systemic issues. It's to do with the big systems that we're trying to bring together, and that they can be quite dramatically misaligned, and so that work needs to be done to make sure that is managed, really, is my main message. Okay, cheers. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. And Judy, we'll come to you for a final perspective on this question, and then we'll move on to the next.
Yeah, thank you. My list was very similar to what has just been presented, so I'll be short and sweet. The main issue that derails effective decision-making on hazards is the last event, okay? And we garner our response in recovery, and we garner our response in a response to that particular hazard. And this has been going on for decades. And now we have this fast-moving situation. And I come back to Wendy's plea, which is have a plan. And if you have a plan that's flexible and which asks questions of when will this plan fail? When will what we are doing fail? When will the bridge fail? Okay, what are the conditions under which that will fail? And to do this, we need a framework, and we need a framework around that can ask these hard questions, not after an event, but now, when we don't have an event. And we can ask that in a way that can work with the communities on the ground. And working with the communities to build that social cohesion locally is the trick. It's about getting the decision makers around the table and getting the communities around the table. And we have a lot of examples now in the last 10 years where this has happened. It's come from Māori communities, it's come from flood risk communities like the Hutt Valley, it's come from coastal communities like the Hawke's Bay and the Coromandel, and now the central government agencies are engaging. The Defence Department has started to think about using this sort of approach, which we broadly call dynamic adaptive pathways planning. And we have other examples in the primary sector, in the transport sector. And so we need to be learning from these examples and sharing those through the sorts of instruments that Tom has talked about. So I'll leave it at that, as I'm sure there's lots of other questions coming in. So thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Yes, we do have a great number of questions in the Q&A. I'm just going to ask one more of our pre-prepared questions, because I think it's an important one. And that is, how can adaptation strategies be tailored to the unique cultural, geographical and socioeconomic contexts of different communities in Aotearoa? Akuhata, would you like to address that one?
Yeah, for sure. I've just been steadily taking notes as all my co-presenters have been saying things that I think align to this question quite a lot. I guess the first point that Nick brought up around adaptation is not only a technical process, but it's also a social one. I think that's really important in terms of situating adaptation strategies in sort of the local scale context. Sometimes there's a lot of work that's sort of more focused on that technical aspect and kind of forgets that the social side is the important part. How do we get our communities on board? How do we listen to what they want, what they think, what they've observed, what they've experienced, and how do we sort of translate that into adaptation planning and strategy? I think that's sort of the crux. And speaking from my experience in terms of sort of trying to tailor adaptation strategies, a lot of the work I've been doing has been with hapu and iwi, mainly coastal hapu and iwi. And a lot of the time it's just going and building a relationship. And once you have that relationship with these communities, the doors open in terms of understanding, you know, what are their experiences, what have they seen, listening to sort of the changes that they've experienced, giving autonomy to them in that decision-making process is a big deal. Having that ownership is really important. Other sort of things, I think that the meaningful engagement is another key aspect that's required to sort of localize adaptation strategies. And I guess talking more around that place-based aspect, the communities that we're working with in these spaces, they're the ones who are on the ground. We are the technical experts, we are the academics, we are the researchers coming in with our piece of mātauranga. But these people on the ground are the ones who are experiencing it and the ones who are going to be experiencing the end product of adaptation. So I think it's just giving them autonomy to have their discussions, bring us in to build that relationship is something that's going to be important in localizing those strategies. And I guess moving forward, I saw there was a question from someone in the Q&A around needing sort of how do we manage both at the national scale, sort of high level guidance and that local scale. I think it's really important to situate ourselves in needing sort of that national guidance on how we go about doing this stuff, but also bring it back down to that local scale, trying to incorporate what's at that high level sort of level and bringing it down so it can work for our communities. I think Lara was going to jump in as well if she had anything to add to that. But those are sort of the key points that I've sort of thought about so far.
Kia ora, Akihata. I actually think you did an excellent job answering that. And so we could move on to more questions from the audience, I reckon, if there are some.
Awesome. Yep, there's heaps. Thank you, Lara. Okay, so let's kick this off. So the first question, this has been addressed to both Judy and Nick. The capability to respond depends in part on social cohesion, and different response options can also build or erode this cohesion. As shocks often leave little time to assess the impacts of such dynamics, thinking on that needs to be done upfront. So what is the state of the work on this to date in New Zealand? Would either of you like to jump in, Judy or Nick?
Well, perhaps I'll just make a few additional comments to what I made. I think I almost answered this in my what I said earlier. We've had 10 years experience now of using techniques that can be used to develop trust and cohesion at the local level. And one of the key lessons coming from that is the engagement of our political people in that process. And I think that's where the shift will be made, is in the local government people and also central government ministers engaging in this issue at a local level. And that requires time, it requires involvement and building trust in the methods and techniques that are used, but also being able to transfer that into lasting, sustainable legislation that doesn't get changed when the political colours change. So it is very important to have that stability and continuity in developing an adaptation framework, for example. But Nick, I'll let you have a quick go.
Yeah, I was just reflecting also on what Tom and Sarah said, that I think, to Judy's point, I think there is actually, and there has been, not only in climate change adaptation, and so a lot of the sort of collaborative governance processes for adaptation are sort of within the last 10 years. But prior to that, there were things that came out of, for instance, the Land and Water Forum, where collaborative processes were set up to try to resolve intractable, wicked, complex problems relating to water quality and quantity, which in some cases did have formal representation from local government. So, for instance, there was a process in the Hawke's Bay nearly 10 years ago. So I think that there is an opportunity to actually learn from some of those other processes. So where we have collectively come together to understand complex problems, where there has been an opportunity to develop, in a way, capability and capacity for dealing with uncertainty among sort of community members, to develop a shared vision, to develop relationships, to develop the social capital and the trust prior to an event. That all of those things, I think there is an opportunity to actually synthesize some of our lessons from a long history of dealing with natural resource management problems, as well as adaptation, and really come up with some sort of nationally consistent, locally relevant best practice. But really, I think there's an opportunity to kind of build this capability and capacity, as Judy says, before the event happens, so that, when there is an event, those social processes, those networks, those relationships, that trust in the science, that confidence in the evidence exists before the event, rather than trying to deal with it in an ad hoc fashion afterwards.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick and Judy. Our next question relates a little bit to the question that Akuhata answered earlier. In your opinion, is a ground-up community-centric adaptation method more efficient than having a standardised national decision-making guideline? Or is there a possibility to have a system that incorporates both approaches? I'd quite like to throw this one to Lara, because I think it's a pertinent question, especially for Māori communities, and I know you've done a lot of work in this space. Lara.
Yeah, I think you definitely have to have both. And I think we can certainly, we can have both. And especially if you look at a tiriti-based or a tiriti-centric approach, you would have, the bicultural or the dual management paradigm at the national scale. So I guess it's at multiple scales. So you're looking at like the national framework, making sure that both Te Ao Māori and Te Ao Pākehā are provided for, there's space created for both within the guidance. And then at the more local level, you can be enabling, through something like a mana whakahōnua arohi agreement, so iwi participation agreement. So we're doing some research on that at the moment to look at how could we, bring adaptation and climate change and things like that into those sorts of agreements, so that when there are events or, to manage risks and vulnerabilities, we can look at the best way to plan for those and manage those and adapt, hopefully, proactively. So I guess my answer is yes, we should have both.
Awesome, thank you. Would any of our other panelists like to jump in on that one?
We've got a couple of comments on that, if I may. 100%, I think it needs to be both. I think building that trust is about showing tangible outcomes as well, particularly for decision makers, I think, in this space. So in Northland, we did some work over the last year or so and funded 28 different Hapori-led community adaptation projects. I guess one of the things that I think we need to work through, and this is where a national framework needs to come into place, is how those locally led frameworks can integrate with frameworks at district and regional scales and national eventually, if we get there. And I think it's a bit of a shame, but we've sort of lost the ability to do regional spatial planning at at the end of last year, but I think those sorts of tools are things that we should look to be able to integrate some of this work into some of those other decision-making spheres, I suppose.
Cool. Okay. I'm going to jump to a question which is on a very aligned issue. And that is, given the various priorities, risk tolerance, funding, and decision-making processes at a local level, does the panel consider we need a national adaptation agency to drive this planning? Obviously, there's a parliamentary inquiry into adaptation going on right now. Would a national level agency be a good outcome of that inquiry? If so, how do you think we can maintain local level nuance while removing the complexity of differing parties' priorities at a local level? I hope that all makes sense. Who would like to jump in and talk about this idea of a national adaptation agency?
Could I just make a few introductory comments on that? I think we have to be really clear. We're very good at setting up new agencies. We're not very good at deciding on functions. Okay, so I think before we jump into agency responses, it makes sense to be very clear about what the problem is we're trying to solve, whether agencies are the best or whether there's a whole lot of other things that can be done. Because as soon as you decide on an agency, they go away and do their thing, and then people are disappointed because they're not doing everything they want them to do, because agencies alone can never solve this problem that we're dealing with in a country which has many, many natural hazards and will be affected by climate change. It's a highly complex issue. So we need something else. And I see that there's a question about transformation, which was addressed to Nick. So maybe, Nick, you could talk about the transformational issue.
Yeah, just kind of very quickly following up on Judy's comment. I think that's a very, very good assessment. I think the as Wendy will sort of speak to, the Tokatuake EQC becoming the Natural Hazards Commission, I think part of that is in response to the fact that we are dealing with a number of interrelated issues, that we are no longer earthquake and is just one of the shocks and stresses that we have to deal with. And that if we had a Kaikoura or a Christchurch at the same time as a Cyclone Gabrielle, which is not unlikely in the future, a coordinated response will be required. And that we've seen time and again that we aren't good at that linked up coordinated response. Second, anyone who's watching with interest the science sector review underway, both of the CRIs and of the universities, if you've read Simon Upton's submission from the PCE, he makes that very point, that we are very good at setting up institutions, but not very good at giving them. So I would be, I think that EDS report, which was very good, made a number of recommendations along the lines of a national adaptation sort of agency. But I think we need to be very clear on not duplicating unnecessary function and actually deciding what it is we're going to deal with. I think on the question of transformation, I think, I haven't seen the question itself, but I do think that we are, and again, this probably kind of points to some of the previous discussion, is that we are constantly reacting. And as Wendy and Judy have both said, we're constantly dealing with things on a short-term incremental basis. And it is very hard to think strategically. It's very hard to think transformationally. Part of that is due to the nature of politics, which Sarah can probably speak to. And the short term, we have short electoral cycles, and we tend to sort of flip-flop between, and so it's very difficult politically to get traction for long-term investment. And we see this with the infrastructure deficit. So how to build bipartisan support for significant investment that may not, that for 100-year investments in infrastructure are needed. So how do we build that bipartisan support? In science and research, it's very difficult to, one of the things that I think this is slightly different, but the fact that we had 10-year investments in mission-led science that provided some stability. It meant researchers weren't spending time competing for funding. They could actually work together on mission-led research. And it's very hard to get traction for that when we have, again, endeavors are 5 years. Other programs are 2 to 3 years of funding. So you're constantly looking for funding, and it's very hard to get that sort of long-term transformational change, even in research and funding, let alone in policy. So I think that transformational change is absolutely needed. I think that we need to move beyond the incremental sort of playing what's in front of us and look up to actually address some of these transformational changes. But doing that is incredibly difficult and actually requires political will, social will, and even a cultural change in how we think about problems and potential solutions.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. And that's a great segue into our next question from Rob Bell. A recent paper from the EU shows extreme weather events do not increase political attention towards environmental and climate issues. How can we as a resilience community move the paradigm from short-term reactive responses to more preemptive planning and policy? So we've talked about short-termism quite a bit so far in this discussion. I just wondered if any of our other panelists had ideas for how we actually do that. How do we move beyond short-termism?
I can chip in here a little bit. I think one thing that really speaks to people is the costs. How much is this going to cost? How much is it going to cost the community? Cost me personally? Is my insurance going to go through the roof and I'm not going to be able to afford insurance? So I think that's probably where the insurers can have a role. And they are already going to risk-based pricing, where that will force people to, I think, plan and preemptively plan. And for our reinsurance, for instance, when we go to get reinsurance on the international market, they actually look at what planning we have in place and the confidence that they have in that planning. So if we're not planning adequately, then that could affect our reinsurance, which then affects everyone. So I think an economic driver is probably, unfortunately, going to be one of the key sort of responses that's required, because I think some of the other consequences, the social consequences and the environmental, aren't really perhaps having as much of an impact as what the economics is going to have. So I think perhaps we unfortunately might need to sort of have the conversation more around the implications for insurance, because it does affect so many people and the decisions that are going to be made in the future. Not ideal, as I said earlier. I think it's a failure when the insurers are actually sort of doing the planning for us, but I think that's something that we should definitely be considering.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you, Wendy. Lara, did you want to have a go at this one?
Yeah, just thinking about how we could overcome short-termism. If simply just empowering a treaty-based approach or system, the system focus and the system change, changing that paradigm so that we do actually have treaty-based management and governance right through all the different scales. I think if we can empower our rangatira, our tribes to be making decisions that are going to impact on our wider communities as well, but in a positive way, I think we can learn a lot. And yeah, I guess Te Ao Māori is more long-term focused. So you have that benefit of that longevity. We plan into the long term. We plan generations, hundreds of years, centuries. And we're also a lot more values-based, values-driven. So, and economics and everything comes into it as well, but all within that longer-term sort of way of thinking. So I think simply empowering our people, and enabling at an equitable scale across Aotearoa, I think would actually benefit all of us in a massive way.
Cool, thank you for that, Lara. I've got another question for Wendy. Who or what organisation could upskill local councillors in this area? How could we make the case to local councillors that they need to think about these things?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's made me think back to when I worked at GNS Science. After the local body elections, sometimes we would get invited to go to a council and spend a couple of hours with the councillors, who are often new, to go through, these are the hazards of your district, these are the things that you need to be watching out for, and here's some ways that you can, help manage them. But that was very much on an invite only, and it only happened a couple of times. But if there was some sort of training as part of the part of when you get a new council in, whether or not that's done, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of issues, not just hazards, that councillors need to be brought up to speed with. But if there's some sort of requirement or support through Local Government New Zealand, or some sort of training that could be appropriate, but it would have to be specific for their district, so that they do understand what science has been done, and what the real threats are. I think that would be a really good start to be able to do that. But it comes down to resourcing. With over 76 or whatever councils in the country, that's a lot of time for someone or some organisation to go around all those different councils to do that. So.
Yeah, okay, cool. Thank you, Wendy. Tom, you're obviously working in the local government sector at the moment. What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I talk all of that that Wendy said, but I'd also like to say that LGNZ developed a climate change module for elected members recently. It's voluntary, however, so it's not going to get the ones who are not interested in it. So it'd be interesting to see what sort of mandatory kind of training that we could encourage for people standing for office. I think would be quite interesting. And also just to say that ASAP is looking at developing a competency framework and a qualifications framework around adaptation that would be NZQA accredited in this space, and so that would look to provide the foundations for decision making for practitioners, but could also be leveraged for decision makers as well.
Cool, thank you both. This next question, Lara has dropped in. It came up at the EDS event last week. When it comes to assessing slow burning hazards like sea level rise versus acute hazards like floods, how can we cover everything that needs covering in the most efficient way? Is it a matter of a criteria-based decision-making model or a prioritisation model in terms of the most urgent risks? And how do we ensure Māori are not further marginalised, especially under governments like the current one, which is trying to limit Māori rights and interests and undermine Te Tiriti? Lara, did you actually want to have a go at that one, or are you raising that for discussion by the panel more widely?
Yeah, no, I was interested in other people's ideas because it just came up at the event for me when I heard Raewyn talking about, she was talking about, so at the moment we're constantly reacting to, floods and cyclones and those acute sort of events, but she was emphasising the point that, the sea level rise and things like that, which are a lot longer and slower, I guess, that those are going to become more important. And I just thought, they're both very important. So how do we, how are we going to manage that? Any thoughts?
I can see Judy's got her hand up, and it relates very much to, adaptive pathways planning. So Judy, what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think the first up, we need to dispel the myth that sea level rise is in the future. That's the first point I'll make. We have time, we have greater certainty with sea level rise in terms of the impact. It will not stop soon, and it will continue. And some communities will not exist in the future. So we do have time to plan, and we have mechanisms whereby these plans can be developed. And But I wanted to speak briefly to the prioritising issue. Many organisations work from a risk base. Wendy raised this point, and I'm mindful of one example I'm familiar with, which is Transpower. Transpower has a risk-based asset management process, which the Auditor General many years ago raised as being at risk, and this was developed as a result of that, where they have on tap things, a hierarchy of equipment, which is prioritised. They hold some things in New Zealand, they have some things offshore. It's based on what happens if a pylon blows over or a substation, someone drops a spanner in it, as happened once close to where I live, and there was blackouts. Often these are related to human error, but they have contingency plans, okay? So part of it is about having systems in place that are based on risk and systems in place that are based on planning for those risks. And that can involve prioritising the most important risks, but not forgetting that the ones that are immediate and happening now just can't be left to crowd out those that we know in the future, well, in the near future and also now are creating problems.
Thank you, Judy. Tom?
Yeah, just to back that up, I think one of the things that we've found at the sort of practitioner end of the spectrum is the need for a spatial understanding of risk and hazard, and let alone common definitions of all those things. That would be great also. But having that nationally sort of enabled spatial understanding of risk and therefore being able to prioritise on place would be really useful. And at the moment, it's incredibly inefficient. We've got local governments up and down the country all spending money on regional approaches to risk planning, which could be massively made more efficient by central government investment in that.
Cool, thank you, Tom. Akihata, did you have any thoughts on this one from a Te Ao Māori perspective?
Yeah, I guess sort of looking at the end of that question around how do we ensure Māori are not further marginalised, especially under the current government. I think a lot of the communities, especially Hapu Niue, just doing what they need to do regardless of what sort of is happening at central and national level. Their communities in general are on the brink of the impact. They're the ones who are experiencing it. So a lot of them are just planning, having wānanga, having workshops, developing their strategies, developing their plans, regardless of what the national government is doing. And I think that's just something that we need to do. We just need to keep chipping away and trying to sort of get wins as we go. However, like it's mentioned before, we still need that national high-level guidance as to how we do this, because it's getting to a point where it's kind of a lot of different communities are doing their plans, but then there's no sort of cohesive direction in terms of from the national scale. So I guess that's something that is actually happening now and something that is going to continue to happen. But yeah, all we can do is just keep pushing and keep supporting our communities to adapt in ways that deliver deliver opportunities for them as communities, and sort of deliver on their community aspirations as well in terms of what they want to see in a changing climate.
Cool, thank you, Akihata. Got a question now that takes us out of the sort of governance and political sphere, right down to the community level, in particular in our rural communities. A question for Nick. What has spun out of the research about influencing those that manage and work the land, i.e. farmers, so that they plan and adapt, and how to give effect to real change when there are competing demands and priorities? So that's a question from Tony Shiska. Nick, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so thanks for your question, Tony. There's still sort of, I think one of the slides that I showed was from some work in the first part of the Resilience Challenge that kind of looked at rural resilience and looked at the types of shocks and stressors that rural communities are managing and have to deal with. And we see increasingly that the rural communities, so Kaikoura, Cyclone Gabrielle, rural communities are in some ways as much on the front line of climate change and the impacts of climate change as coastal margins and coastal communities are. That the rural industries, primary sectors are dealing with the climate-related risks, but also increasingly a number of financial and market-related risks, greater drives for transparency in supply chains, which is going to put additional pressure on the need to probably change management practices in order to continue to serve different markets, whether that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions or actually putting in place adaptive management strategies to reduce liabilities. So I think that in terms of rural adaptation, I think there is progress. I think it's still quite piecemeal. I think there are some sectors that are further along than others in terms of adapting to climate change. And I do think, and part of that is driven not only by sort of domestic experiences and domestic sort of priorities and pressure, but probably the most strategic and forward-looking changes are happening in industries where they are very aware that overseas markets and overseas conditions are actually going to determine what the future looks like for them. So there is, and this is largely driven by the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure reporting requirements. So the likes of Zespri is taking very seriously the need to manage climate-related risks for a multi-billion-dollar industry, which is the kiwifruit industry, because key European and Asian markets will demand it, and their shareholders will demand it. So climate change is just one sort of driver, and I think that we do need to continue to take a very holistic sort of view of how rural industries and the rural communities sort of manage risk.
Cool, thank you, Nick. I have a question from Georgina, who is tuning in from Lismore, our international audience today. Welcome, Georgina. What are some cost-effective methods for implementing adaptation pathways in communities with limited resources and infrastructure, particularly for flood risk in a very engineered and degraded catchment with decaying flood mitigation schemes? So I guess to sum up that question, it's around a catchment in a community with large problems and perhaps few resources to address some of these adaptation issues. Who would like to have a go at that one?
I could make a few comments. And thanks for the question, Georgina. I think some of the work in and around rivers communities in New Zealand is pretty good in many instances. I think there's some good work in terms of framing adaptation as, in the whole spectrum of solutions that encompasses. But in terms of cost-effective approaches, I think working within catchments in New Zealand, so New Zealand's a slightly different context to New South Wales. I worked in New South Wales for almost 10 years. And some of those catchment programs, I think, are probably some of the best places to start. The community groups that are in those areas are really strong as well. And looking at how those place-based mechanisms, systems, sort of water systems can be leveraged to understand the problem. But then also thinking about where some of those funding mechanisms might be, or some of those levers. And I think in New Zealand, we've got examples within the emergency management space around having bottom lines within catchments around things like community response plans and early warning systems and things where we can. That should be relatively cost effective as a first immediate kind of thing. Obviously, stop banks are part of that as well, but that's a different question. I know that's particularly interesting in your region, so I wouldn't want to comment on what's happening around there.
Thank you, Tom. Anyone else want to have a go at that question? Okay, we'll move on. The next question I'm going to go to is for Wendy. It's a long question, so I will attempt to summarise. In the context of fostering linked up central government and local government risk reduction and planning, and the current chasm between science and policy that Sarah has acknowledged, in terms of the wider risk reduction focus for the Natural Hazards Commission Tokatuake, do you think this will elevate Tokatuake in terms of taking a more strategic leadership role for risk reduction conversations in Aotearoa?
Okay, I think we've, prior to our name change and legislative change, we were already taking a role in this area. So working very closely with Ministry for the Environment and some of the policy development around the new, what was new legislation that got repealed, and then the new national direction. We're already working very closely with MB, and we have an engineer, Ken Elwood, who's half-time with us and half-time at MB to strengthen that linkage. We have strong linkages with NEMA and a whole lot of other government organisations. So I think as far as the change of our name and legislation, it's just really strengthening the mandate that we've already got to try and do that. But we need this isn't just about us, though. You know, there is, you know, Ministry for the Environment and MB and Department of Internal Affairs, you know, all these other government agencies, and also all the researchers as well. I think one thing that we are fortunate about with our organisation is that we are quite well linked into different research projects and programs across universities, across different endeavours, what was the science challenges, and we have our own funding of research that we undertake as well, and trying to get the linkages with that. So I think we can play and continue to play a pivotal role as far as trying to make sure everything's sort of consistent, I guess, because that's one of the issues that we have around it, particularly at the moment with inconsistent policies, and trying to make sure that the science is being used appropriately for policy development. So I think as far as our role going forward, it's definitely been strengthened, and we're going to continue to keep doing what we're doing as far as trying to, you know, bring all that together and to be a leader in this area. But yeah, it's just continuing what we were already in line to be doing, which is great.
Cool, thank you, Wendy. One of our most popular questions this morning is again about education, but more about education for the community rather than for councillors, like we spoke about earlier. So in terms of partnering with communities, what needs to come before that around community education on natural hazards, and in a way that enhances trust when trust in authorities is in decline. In terms of the research that's going on, were there any findings around community education approaches that have worked well? Who would like to have a go at that one?
I'll just make a few comments. I think all of us have been called on and have participated in our community discussions, often where we live or in the region, and also around New Zealand from time to time. But somebody made the point earlier that we can't do that effectively or efficiently, and that we need some mechanism whereby there's a call-up group of people who are funded to be able to do that. And whether that comes through professional groups, whether it comes through local government New Zealand, is centrally government funded. I think probably all of the above And I think there is work going on in some of the related programs. Rebecca Priestley has been involved in the CRISE program, looking specifically at what sort of communication methods operate well. There is a need for more understanding of that. There are other researchers that others will be aware of doing that work. And we know from international research what works and what doesn't work. But the critical thing is, how do you take that knowledge and enable it to be transmitted appropriately to different groups of people, because they need tailoring. So it is a challenge, but we have no current mechanism to do that, nor funding to do that.
Judy, if I can stay with you for a moment, in terms of the Hawke's Bay coastal strategy, the Clifton to Tangoio strategy that your team studied in phase 1 of the Resilience Challenge, what did the communication piece look like there? As the community and mana whenua consultation was rolled out, was there a piece there around getting the community up to speed on the current science?
There were several things done. Paula Blackett, who may be online, may be able to answer that better than I have. But I recall we had, at the end of the panel meetings, there were panels set up, which I have to say were self-selected panels, which was not necessarily representative of the community. 3 mana whenua groups were included in that process, and there were separate mana whenua conversations in the multi-criteria analysis and DAP process that was undertaken. But there was an attempt to ask questions of the panelists after each panel session around how they were communicating to their people. There was a report prepared, which I think Julia Becker and Paula Blackett did. And there were also supermarket Main Street surveying that was undertaken for that process to try and get a better fix on what people knew. And it was pretty clear. People in the street did not know. They did not know what was going on. There were evening sessions held for understanding what the program was. And unfortunately, they were held at times when both women, young people, Māori weren't able to attend. So it isn't probably the best example. And I'm sure there are others who have learnt from some of those experiences and applied them in a better way in other examples. But I think the point is that we're learning how to do this, and it will evolve. But there are lessons from the research that we've undertaken.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Judy. Sarah and Tom, we'll come to you briefly and then we'll move on to the next question. Sarah.
Unmute myself. I just wanted to just make a couple of points about that. I totally agree with Judy. It's something that, is, and I just think there's a very strong emphasis on scientists somehow transmitting science to communities. And I think that approach is really problematic. So that what you really want to think about, and this is really why I think it's a question that perhaps Lara and Akuhata might be well placed to answer, you really want to think about mutual learning here. So it's not as if the science is the key thing. So I think one of the first steps is to make sure that you don't think that you're in a position to go out and educate, communities about the truth of science. So I guess that's really just my comment is, you need to think about this as a collaborative activity, the sort of thing Tom's talking about, rather than something where scientists are sort of marched out to, dispense the knowledge kind of thing. So sorry if my tone seems a little bit intensity, but I do find that worrying in a way. So that's all I have to say for that.
Great.
There are other examples in Dunedin which are very well placed, which I think someone on the panel may be more familiar with than I am, but Dunedin has undertaken some very interesting community-based, bottom-up type exercises.
Thank you. Tom, did you want to? Oh, yes, sorry.
I'll
Quickly come
just
to
quickly
Tom if you
respond
want
to
to,
that.
and then Lara and...
Okay, yep.
Tom's muted himself. Yep, okay, Lara, you go for it.
Okay, yeah, I was wanting to say something as well. So nice that was pointed out. But basically, around community education, that sort of thing, I think the wānanga methodology, that's what it's all about. Like, I think the Makatū whānau and their climate change strategy, they have been so generous with, in the first place, they've done an amazing job. They've been very proactive, but then they're also out there sharing what they've learnt, their process, what they've come up with. They've won an award for their strategy, and so I've heard them present it multiple times, and just the amount of effort and time and I guess manaakitanga that they're providing to us all by doing that, I just think is amazing, and that is educating all of us on what can be done, what can be achieved. When Akuhata and I were very privileged to be able to host or hold a wānanga there with about 100 Māori planners and practitioners looking at community-led retreat and doing a collective submission to that inquiry. And that was at Makatū, at Whakaue Marae. And so they hosted us there, and whānau from across the whole country actually that came to that one. And so having these places where we can all get together and all share our knowledge and expertise and experiences and things, we can all educate each other and learn together, I guess, as well. It's that mutual learning. And what's happened in one place, we've all got, every localized area has got its own context, but you can help each other, I guess, raise what your issues are, and then someone else might have a similar one and they've done something. So it's all that kind of thing, which I think, wānanga is an amazing, it just makes a lot of sense. And I think also it doesn't have to be only Māori that are doing that, but if we were to acknowledge how much value there is in a wānanga, then, or hui, and having those sorts of things held at marae, well then you have to be hosted by, the haukanga or the marae whānau, and there's certain tikanga protocols and things around that, and so there's just all these processes and things that we can all learn and benefit from at the same time. So just creating these spaces and valuing these spaces, I think, is really important and a great opportunity for all of us to be doing this education type thing together. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lara. That's really great. In terms of the wānanga that Lara and Akuhata organised with the Makatū community, I've just dropped a video in the chat that we made about that kaupapa. And I can see that someone has dropped in the chat also the information about the South Dunedin work that Dunedin City Council has been doing. I'm aware we are coming up to just sort of our last 5 minutes, so we'll need to wrap up shortly. But Akuhata, did you want to say anything following on from Lara's comments about community education and that sort of education going both ways?
Yeah, of course, I totally agree. I totally agree with all that's been said, both by Sarah and by Lara. But something that I've sort of learned the more I've done sort of these wānanga, especially with hapu and iwi, and I guess something that relates to the question around what needs to happen before the planning really starts. And we've noticed, especially with hapu, is just having a safe space to express their mamae that they've experienced. I think that's something that isn't done quite a lot, and the sort of planning wānanga that we've had that's been an integral starting point is just for everyone to get their mamae out on the table, and then we try to sort of find pathways forward to sort of move from that. I think that's something that we need to actively do and something that we need to bear in mind, because when we're talking about these decisions such as relocation or doing something that interrupts sort of connection to whenua, connection to place, and if we ignore that mamae, we just sort of, again, pushing the can down the road in terms of delivering those positive outcomes for our community. So that's something I guess we should all sort of have that discussion. I think that that's not just for Māori communities as well, that goes for all communities. There's a lot of I guess you could say sour grapes in terms of relationships that we need to address, and we need to sort of bring those to the forefront when we're having these discussions. So that's a bit of my some of my 10 cents to that korero, but yeah, just totally agree with what's been said.
Thank you, Akuhata. I think we're going to have to leave it there in terms of the questions. There have been so many fantastic questions, and I'm sorry if we didn't get to yours. I'm making an assumption here, but I am guessing that our panelists would welcome further questions by email. If you have a particular question, getting some thumbs up there. If you have a particular question for one of our panelists, do feel free to get in touch with them. I just want to open it back up to the panel one more time and ask, was there anything that you there's a lot of themes coming through in our discussion this morning, but is there anything that you particularly would like to say that you haven't had a chance to say, something new perhaps that hasn't been raised, any insights from your research or anything like that? No? Okay, ka pai. I think everyone's probably a little bit talked out and ready for a cup of tea and maybe some lunch. There's just one thing I wanted to mention before we close with the karakia this morning. Obviously, the Resilience Challenge, we officially came to an end on the 30th of June. Our team is around for just a little while longer until the end of August as we sort of do our closeout activities. But we do have one final webinar coming up on the 5th of August, which is very pertinent to this discussion, and that is showcasing the work from a team mostly from the University of Waikato, Ian White, Christina Hanna, Raven Cretney and Sarah Bevan, who is on this call, and their project has been titled De-risking Resilience, and it's around getting more into that nitty-gritty of how do we actually address some of these barriers to taking up this latest research and policy and practice when it comes to risks for decision makers, political risks, financial risks, reputational risks, legal risks, all of those things. So that should be a really interesting discussion. We will be putting information about that webinar out on our channels this week. As I mentioned earlier, we have recorded this session, so again, we'll be making that available to all of you. So before we move to our closing karakia, I'd just like to thank all of our panelists once more for making themselves available for this really great discussion. Thank you for everyone who attended and asked such wonderful questions. Yeah, it's been great. Thank you for everyone. I'll just close us out with our final karakia. Kia whakaria te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia turaki whakataha ai, kia turaki whakataha ai. Haumi e, hui e, tāiaki e. Thank you and ka kite.